So, continuing with our lesson regarding research, okay, the research problem and the research objectives. In conducting research, there will be types of research based from the source where you obtain the information. So, we are now through with the general types of researches, right? That concerns qualitative and quantitative and all the other classifications. Now, in conducting research, there are actually two more types of research, and that is based from the source where you obtain the information. So when we say from the source where you obtain the information, where did you find your data? Or where can you gather data? Okay? So, there are two. Okay? So, what are those two? We have primary and secondary researches. So, let us try to differentiate primary and secondary research. So, we have these 5 factors that can differentiate primary and secondary research. So, the first attribute or the first factor that can differentiate the two is the attribute source, where you find the information or where you obtained the information. So, in primary research, you can obtain your information or you can have sources coming from the primary sources. Primary sources. So, whenever we say primary sources, okay, you conduct research from the source itself. We conduct research from the source itself. So, meaning to say, in primary research, if your source is the primary source, it means that you have a direct contact to the source. You have a direct contact to the professional, direct contact to the author, meaning to say, it can be obtained by means of interviewing or interviews. Okay? So, that is the main source of primary research. However, in secondary research, okay, the basis of some data collected in secondary research is from someone, okay, who had got it from some source. So, meaning to say, it came from indirect sources or secondary sources, indirect sources. So, the basis of the data came from someone who had got the information from other sources. Meaning to say, when we conduct secondary research, we rely on, let's say, books. And these books was actually made by some author. So, you don't have a direct contact to the author because you did not, or let's say, we did not conduct an interview with the author. We just relied on the facts the author written in his or her books. Okay? So, it's an indirect source. Whereas in primary research, we conduct research when we interview the primary source. And these primary sources can be the author, can be the professionals like doctor when you interview a doctor. But when you use a material authored by the doctor, it is now secondary sources or indirect sources. So that is the main difference between primary research and secondary research in terms of source. Now, let us differentiate them in terms of cost. In primary research, okay, it is expensive. It is costly. Why? Because primary research is expensive due to the fact that they require primary researches. So, meaning to say, they require professionalism. They are expensive because they require primary resources. So, example, you want to interview a specific professional from the scientific discipline or medical discipline. You have to make an effort to, let's say, go or transport yourself over their institute. And when you transport yourself over the institute where you can interview the professional, you are let's say you are spending money. Okay, you are spending money for the fare, for the transportation. That is why it is expensive. Okay, while in secondary researches, it is less expensive than primary research. It is not expensive at all because it does not involve primary resources. Okay, not expensive at all because let's say you want an information right away, you can consider using the internet. And internet is widely let's say widely accessible to all. You do not have to make an effort to release more amounts of money. That is why secondary researches is not expensive or less expensive than primary research because it doesn't require primary resources. Okay, you can have the access already online or published. Okay? Next, we have the third attribute, which is the time taken to conduct. So the third attribute in which the time taken to conduct concerns with the duration of primary and secondary researches. In primary researches, it is actually or let's say it is usually time consuming. Okay, the time taken is long, time consuming, long duration. Okay, while in secondary researches, the time taken is short. Time taken is short. Okay, why? Because in primary researches, so let's say if it is expensive, okay, if it is expensive, it is also time consuming. Why? Because let's say you will conduct a study that requires surveys, and survey must come from a direct interview from a person. Now, it is time consuming because it will take you hours or some minutes to produce questionnaires, to print some questionnaires. And it is also expensive because you will have printing materials. Also, when you transport yourself from one place to another just to interview a person, it is time consuming because the duration of the travel is very long. Let's say you are coming from Quezon province, but the professional you want to interview is in Quezon City, in Manila. The time travel is long. So, meaning to say, it is time consuming. While in secondary research, it is only one click away. It is only one read away. Because it relies on primary or published researches already. Meaning to say, you do not have to conduct a research anymore to get the information. You just have to browse for it. That is why it is the duration of secondary research is much shorter than primary research. Next, in the results gathered, okay, the results produced by primary research is known to have better quality. Why? Because the researcher has a direct contact to the professionals. Okay, it can produce much specific information. While in secondary research, it is usually summarized. The results are usually summarized because it came from indirect sources. Meaning to say, the general concepts and ideas that you obtained in secondary research is broad. It is generalized. So, meaning to say, the results in primary research is much specific, while the secondary research, it is much generalized. Okay? And lastly, the presentation. Okay, the presentation. So, when we say presentation, how do you, let's say, how do you show it to the public? Okay? How do you defend it to the public? So, in primary researches, the presentation is presented with a lot of hard work and dedication. Okay? And it is presented with the homogeneous kind of data. Okay? It is produced with the homogeneous kind of data, meaning to say it stands alone on itself. Okay? The source or the knowledge stands alone on itself. And so since it is time consuming, it is expensive, you exerted more effort. That is why it is more dedicated and it is more hardworking. While in secondary research, it is presented with varied data, heterogeneous data. The data is varied. Why? Because there are different sources. There is no direct sources. There is no one source only. There are different kinds of data to be represented. Okay? There are different ideas and concepts to be, let's say, consolidated. Okay? So, normally, the secondary research presents a varied data and with a number of data of several sources. Okay? So, normally, it is presented with a number of data. Okay? And sources. The data and sources do not stand alone on itself. It must have other supporting data, other supporting sources. While in the presentation of primary researches, it is homogeneous. It can stand alone on itself. Okay, you do not have other data that interferes with the standalone data. So this is the main difference between primary and secondary researches. And these primary and secondary researches is actually applied in your SIP. Okay, why? Because in primary researches, you can conduct an interview with the professionals, while in secondary research, we conduct a review and review of the related literature and studies. So this ends our discussion with the types of research based on the source where you obtain the information. Okay? Oh, in another thing, okay, in additional, before we end this discussion, so we have an additional knowledge. Okay, so let us try to let's say add this knowledge. So in primary research, we use primary sources, right? Primary source. So how do we define primary source? Primary source is when a researcher has a direct contact to the original source. Okay? So example of applying primary source, person B interviews person A, and with the use of the interview of person B with person A, person B created a manuscript out of it. So person B created a product out of the interview due to the primary source. Now, another type of source is the secondary source, which is used in secondary research. Secondary source. So in secondary source, there is no direct contact. No direct contact. Okay. to the original source. There is no direct contact with the original source. So example, let's say for instance, person C has no direct contact to person A, which person B interviewed. So person C relied on the manuscript made by person B. Okay? So meaning to say, primary sources are the building blocks of secondary sources. So that is the main essence of types of researches based on the source where you obtain the information.